Sure. Well, to start with, I think it's important to note that Washington State's a very trade-dependent state. I think British Columbia is well, Idaho, but we're keenly aware in Washington of the importance of being able to move products overseas. 90% of our wheat goes overseas, as to 60% of our potatoes, 40% roughly of our apples. So trade has been a huge. I mean, it's sometimes there's a windfall associated with trade, and sometimes we have deficits associated with trade. And lately, we've been suffering both apples. You just mentioned pulses. The India retaliatory tariffs against pulses and apples really actually decimated both of those sectors of our ag economy. India's agreed to pull those off, so that's an opportunity. We think we'll see improved exports, greatly improved exports to India, which was one of, prior to the tariffs, was one of our most important customers. In 2023 also, we're seeing there's a federal farm bill that's in progress. We're hoping that it wraps up by the end of the year, because our guesstimate is that if we don't get a farm bill in 23, because 24 is an election year, it'll be 25 before we see the farm bill. But one of the major pushes for the 23 farm bill has been to see an increase in market access program funding. That's the federal funding that goes to cooperators who help advocate for movement of products overseas. It's been flat since 2008, so it's gone from basically, in 2008, it was a $200 million appropriation. It's still $200 million, but in today's dollars, those 2008 dollars are now about $125 million. So we've drastically reduced the amount that we're spending on our investing in the foreign market. I think for our state, one of the things that we're kind of behind the other states in terms of a product branding program, something like a Washington grown label be used on products to help support identification of Washington products. And and finally, I would mention on the opportunity side is we do have a competitiveness study that's up and running. We hope that's going to be very important in terms of telling us how do Washington farmers and ranchers stay competitive in this very difficult current environment. In terms of challenges, we really haven't seen much in the way of federal trade actions like free trade agreements. We're in a position of needing to expand the markets, and it really hasn't been a lot of progress made in that regard recently. And the last thing I mentioned on challenges is that the supply chain issues, inflation, the input costs have just grown enormously. There's a little relief this year relative to last year. The largest of those input costs for industries such as the tree fruit industry is labor, and there's no simple solutions there. It's a chronic problem. We do need, one thing that could be done is modernization of what's called the H-2A program, the federal labor H-2A visa program. It has not been modernized in a long time. It really needs it, because we're becoming increasingly dependent on that program to keep our tree fruit industry in business.
Yeah, thanks for that. Chanel, do you have anything to add?
I'm going to echo a lot of what Derek said. So we also are a very export-dependent state. Perhaps one of the differences in Idaho, though, is we have a small population, especially compared to Washington. So you heard earlier today, if we consumed all of our production domestically, we didn't export anything, how much we would have to eat in this state every single day. 140 slices of bread, 3 pounds of sugar, 40 potatoes. I mean, the list goes on, and I really do my part on the cheese and meat side, but we are not going to consume all of that. So exports are incredibly important to us. I think in terms of strengths, we continue to produce, and I would say regionally, because we benefit a lot from the same weather and things like that, we produce some of the finest quality products in the world. And I think our friends in Canada would talk about pulses and all the wonderful things that you produce. We certainly would say that in terms of livestock and potatoes and wheat and apples and the things that we have to market to the world are truly exceptional. In Idaho, we have some serious challenges though with transportation, and I'm going to touch on labor a little bit too. I was recently in Japan for a trade mission with USDA, And one of the things that we heard over and over in Japan, and that's an important beef market for us in Idaho, we heard over and over, we love Idaho or US products when we can get them. And challenges in transportation from COVID and really pre-COVID as well are a challenge. And for Idaho, we have, because of that small population, we are also not a magnet to receive trucks. We're not a magnet for the rail industry to service us. And so I think what we have to do as a state and regionally as well a bit is make sure that we are good customers, that we can't always just look at the railroad and say you have to stop, we're mad at you for not stopping. We have to position ourselves as really good customers where they can't turn us down. And I think part of what we are missing and what I hope to see in future years is something that looks like a very cohesive private-public partnership. That the state of Idaho, I think, has an interest in doing something with transportation. I don't believe those projects do well without a private hook. They have to have private interest. Someone out there who is on a boots on the ground doing this every day has to have skin in the game. It can't be government saying this is a good project, you all should invest. So I think that's a challenge for us. And then of course labor. I would absolutely be remiss if I didn't talk about it. Our dairy industry is our #1 sector in the state. It is over a third of our ag receipts as a whole. We're the #3 dairy state. I can't overemphasize how important the dairy industry is, not just to ag, but truly to the state of Idaho. 90% of the workforce in dairy is foreign-born. And so in agriculture in Idaho, I think we try to have a very comprehensive and honest and ethical conversation about immigration reform and really what we need to do on the labor side, because it is dire, and we somewhat suffer from a really wonderful economy in the state, which is great, until you have to hire people, and it makes it really challenging. Our unemployment is quite low. We have counties that have a 1 in front of their unemployment numbers, and that is an almost impossible environment to hire in. So we very much want to talk about immigration reform as well.
Yeah, thanks. I think we'll just come back down the line. Rolly, do you have anything to add to this? I think Zach and Harold do, so we might as well just come back down the line.
Yeah, I got a lot more to say about some of the other things that I want to talk about too, so I will keep this one brief, but I appreciate Derek's comments too. BC has been focused, for example, on the, figuring out how do we help brand. People, I think, are paying a lot more attention in terms of where the food is coming from, and so, how do we do that effectively? And for a place like BC, it's not going to matter if if this is BC, we have that program and we do that, but the same applies to Washington, right? I live 2 kilometers from the U.S. border, from the Washington State border, so people appreciate that too, right? It's the knowledge and the transparency there, which I think is really significant. And to the previous comments as well around labor, that's across the board, and it doesn't matter what sector it is. Certainly in BC, everywhere, labor is an enormous challenge. And so the one interesting opportunity there has been working with our rural colleges. So my final is rural development. I get to work with the rural colleges and try to figure out how do we actually kind of navigate what education and training looks like to get people into those industries, inspire some of those people in very rural communities, and do so in a way that kind of lowers the barriers for them to enter into the industry that they might be excited about. We heard that comment about agriculture is sexy. Well, it's not unless you have some opportunity to see that and understand what it is. And so figuring how do we do that relies on a bunch of technology to bring it to people and then get them inspired and get them into that industry.
When we talk about exports in Montana, it's important to highlight the strong working relationship that the state has with the BNSF Railroad. All of our bulk commodities are moved up by rail. So we're very happy to see the second lake crossing at Lake Ponderay. I suspect PNWER was involved in advocating for increasing the efficiency and turn times of those BNSF trains, as well as the labor at the ports, putting the product onto the ocean-going vessels. Very eager to see this most recent longshoreman labor agreement extended to avoid any disruptions at that leg of the journey. And then we very much value our strong economic and cultural ties to the Southeast Asian markets. This summer we're hosting 9 teams of foreign visitors to Montana, and they visit many of the surrounding states and provinces while they're in country as well. And they're big investors directly in Montana, with the Marabini Group or Nippon Flour Mills. Part of what attracts them to the PNW is access to hydroelectric power, an initiative that resonates politically in Asian countries. So we value that trade partnership. They might have to pay a little more for a product coming out of Montana or Idaho, but they know that it's a quality that they desire and that it sells in their market. So that's the strength of building relationships and meeting and knowing your customers.
Yeah, Saskatchewan, like Montana, Idaho, we're a landlocked province, so we primarily rely on rail or trucks, and we got a little saying that we need to keep grain on the train and oil in the pipeline, so we stand by that immensely. But our largest trading partner is the U.S., and continued two-way trade is critical for us and as well as the entire PNWER group. So we got to maintain that relationship. Key markets are grains, oil seeds, or canola oil, canola meal. So that trade is imperative. When it comes internationally, we see a lot of protectionism going up, and I should back up. We're just coming off a strike on the West Coast here. I don't think it's been ratified yet, but we hope to be soon. So that kind of handcuffs us somewhat. It backs everything up right from the heart of the province to the coast. There's just no way around it. And our potash producers have reduced production during that time, and it really slows down our productivity. So, but protectionism around the world is growing, and like I said, the U.S. is our main trading partner, so we've got to maintain that while continuing to look internationally. So, as part of Saskatchewan's initiative to get into some global markets, we're focusing a lot on the Indo-Pacific region as a priority market for our province, and we've opened 5 trade offices in that area. The province of Saskatchewan has opened those 5 trade offices. We've opened 9 in total around the world, and it's to help support our market diversification. You got to keep out in front of marketing your products. As the PNWER group is, as well as Saskatchewan, we are net exporters. We're a relatively small population, and we rely on U.S. states and countries around the world to buy what we produce. And we want to open our doors to those delegations to come and see how we grow our grains, our oil seeds, our value-add products, how we mine our potash in the most sustainable way possible. Our professional football team's got green colors, but we also say our potash is very green, and that's very true. We have to tell our story to our friends and neighbors here, like the PNWER group, and all the U.S. states, but we have to get that word out around the world. Those trade offices are an important launchpad for attracting investment and selling our products, and I can't say that enough. We are a net trading province, and we have to continue to promote ourselves and our producers of farming products and farmer seeds.
Yeah, thanks, Daryl. And the point you touched on there is we're so reliant on the road and rail network in every direction, but especially in Tidewater. And that doesn't matter if it's energy products or crop inputs or grain and food products. Tidewater access is huge for exporting jurisdictions like ours, and I see that as a challenge and an opportunity is working with our port authorities and maybe even expansion into new ports, whether it's Churchill or Prince Rupert or expansion in some of those smaller ports. I see that as if we're going to produce more, we're going to need more access to Tidewater. So, Ken, do you want to?
Yeah, maybe we'll wrap things up over the last few minutes here. And some of you folks have touched on this a little bit in some of your different answers. But, obviously for the morning session, we talked a lot about the global demand for food and how critical that is moving forward. So maybe we can just build out a few more thoughts you might have on this. So as we experience that increased demand, what are some of the challenges we should be addressing in the region? I know some of you touched on labor, but I don't think we've talked a whole lot about water or anything like that. So, or even the climate impacts. So maybe we could just go down the line and talk about some of the key challenges for you, and is there a way that we can address that from a region-wide perspective and partner with the different provinces and the states to maybe do a better job of that? Yeah, if you wanna, let's go down the line there, so.
So certainly we can talk about water in Idaho, and there's folks in the room who are going to talk about it just a little bit. So I might save that for them, but I would encourage you, if that's something you're interested in, please attend the water session because it's extremely valuable. And I always tell folks, in Idaho, you're never a dabbler in water. You listen to some experts, they've spent their whole life doing it. So I very much try to listen to those folks. But I am gonna talk a little bit about farmland preservation, which is a huge issue in our state. So you may know that Idaho has been the fastest growing state, either number 1 or number 2 for many years. This valley, if you were to have been here 20 years ago, it probably looks unrecognizable today. My husband grew up in Meridian, which at the time was still an agricultural community just outside of Boise. He grew up on a dairy farm, and when he was little, the population was about 8,000. Today, I'm sure it's well over 100, 150. I honestly don't even know how big Meridian is anymore. It's all meshed with Boise, and this greater metro area has grown leaps and bounds, and it has come at some severe costs. There's certainly opportunities, and we've seen a booming economy, but we have a loss of farmland in the state that is pretty staggering, honestly, and it creates some challenging dynamics even within agriculture. So let's set aside urban development or suburban development for a second, we'll come back to that. But within agriculture, it creates a almost uneven layer of competition. So you have a scarcity of acres, and we have very big farms that sometimes there is this perception that there isn't this equality out there, and that is a really hard thing. I don't think that is necessarily the case, but it's something we hear about and something folks are challenged with. And then suburban development is huge, and so I think we don't know what the answer is in Idaho. I think you're going to see an approach in the next couple of years that examines voluntary efforts, but voluntary efforts are maybe just one part of the puzzle, and at the end of the day, there is always the cost question. So everyone says that they value farmland and they want to see it continue in production, but nobody is willing to generally put the cost between the price differential. So farmland is here, and the cost of development is here, and no one is willing to tell Grandpa that land that you have worked on for the last 60 years, you can't sell. You can't, we know that was your retirement, but you can't do anything with it. And that is a heartbreaking reality here in Idaho that I think that we need to find a way forward.
So, I mean, the reality of, what we need to overcome in order to provide, or meet global demand, over the next, say, 4 decades, maybe even 3 decades, we're gonna see a need to double the amount of food production in the world on the same amount of land with the same amount of water, basically. And so it's an enormous challenge for productivity. We've got to become even more productive by far than we are today. I think, we can start with water. Water technology is key, was one of the keys to that in terms of how do you stretch water as far as possible. The other, there's compounding problems with climate change, for example, where we expect longer growing seasons, so we'll need to supply water to plants for a longer period of time, particularly tree fruit or other perennials. I think Washington's a state where we've actually invested in water supply development and in water supply technology development in a fairly big way, particularly in eastern Washington. We're frequently, we see droughts on a relatively common level in eastern Washington. In fact, even this year where we thought we were fine, sort of a stealth drought that we went into April thinking everything's cool, great, got lots of water, and then May hit with a lot of warm temperatures, dried our soils out, our snowpacks all melted off, or not all of it, but largely melted off. So that's going to be something we're faced with year after year, and we're trying to come up with innovative solutions, restore floodplain function, and do things that will allow us to have more resilient water supply systems. We also need to invest in research, agricultural research, schools like Washington State University, Idaho. We need to make sure that we've got breeding programs, gene editing, that sort of thing that's helping to deal with both the needs of the livestock industry and the plant industry with respect to plants. Drought-tolerant varieties or drought-tolerant strains are what we need to develop more of. Also, heat resistance. Oregon State University, part of the student, Washington State, Idaho, have been developing potato varieties that are heat resistant. Why is that important? Because we've seen longer periods of heat waves, and that with older breeds that didn't hold up well, and that deformed the potato. With the newer breeds, we're not seeing that. They're actually holding up quite well. So it's important that we're doing that kind of research. And finally, we've got a soil health initiative that's a joint venture with Washington State University, our industry, and our conservation commission to really understand the state of soils in Washington, and also to look at best practices for maintaining good moisture holding capacity, organic content, incorporating regenerative agriculture and other methods that would give us more long-term sustainable soils. So, thank you.
Thank you, Director. I hate to interrupt you, Board, in the interest time, we only got a couple of minutes left, so if you had a quick comment, and then we'll wrap in, want to get people in the other sessions. Probably should have put this question toward the front.
I was just gonna say, again, this kind of question could have been the whole conversation. I think it's so important. I really appreciate, yesterday we heard somebody say it's so-called climate change, right? And one of us is politicians, I think, and then this morning, for example, we hear Garrett from Simplot kind of reference how sensitive our production systems are to 1 degree difference in temperature that they're seeing, or the snowfall on the peaks coming off a little early, right? Those are the kinds of climate change impacts to our systems that we're so sensitive to. And like Darryl, you mentioned was the 4 Rs, right? Those are the kinds of opportunities too. I mean, we look around, ag is 20% of global emissions, right? Huge opportunity there. 4 Rs, for example, if we can do it right, and that relies on a bunch of technology, but it relies also on the willingness, that there's a low-hanging fruit, right? Like there's an opportunity where we plot out the potential reduction in those greenhouse gases, and the cost that comes with it. Those are negative, right? If we can do them, it costs the producers less than it does right now. But we have to be able to come into the conversation effectively and deliver that. And again, like we've been really digging into with the SCAP program as well, and locally in BC, we're digging into the regenerative ag conversation. Like, how do we support producers that know how to do this, want to do this? How do we help them do that? And again, I'd love to talk more about that. So you can't stare at me as well. It's not good.
No, thanks everyone. We are unfortunately out of time. Another hour probably seems like it could have been the right amount because we had such a good panel and good numbers. But thanks to all. Please join Ken and I in thanking our panelists.